Introduce our guest speaker to you today, Ms. Charity Wallace, who's speaking in our Women and National Security Speaker Series. We've had a few others speak in this series last year. We have a few more coming up this year, and we're proud to host Ms. Charity Wallace today. Ms. Wallace currently serves as a senior advisor at the Global Women's Initiative at the George W. Institute. Most recently, she served as the founding vice president of the Global Women's Initiative and a senior advisor to Ms. Laura Bush, Mrs. Laura Bush, the former First Lady. She served as chief of staff to Laura Bush in 2009 and 10, and she served in the Bush administration in a variety of roles, including deputy chief of protocol for the United States and director of advance for the First Lady. She's also recently a graduate of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the founder and principal at Wallace Global Impact, a consulting firm that works with leaders, corporations, and nonprofit organizations around the world. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Charity Wallace.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Dr. Miller. I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon and honored to speak to you all about women. And really, women in foreign policy uncover some of the reasons why it's critical for women to be included in every aspect of society. So I thought I'd start today by telling you a little bit about my own story and then speak about the work that I'm doing, including the work as the senior advisor to the Bush Institute. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a specific case study I conducted for my thesis that I've just completed on why Tunisia has been more successful than Egypt in their transition to democracy, and that has a lot to do with women. So my own story was really shaped by strong women who have encouraged and prepared me to do the work that I'm doing now. I was blessed to work for remarkable women like Laura Bush and Nancy Brinker, who started the Susan G. Komen for the Cure. And these women have been my mentors and have taught me critical lessons about being an effective leader. I'm also very fortunate, I'm sure many of us share this in the room, to have a very strong mother and a very strong grandmother and great-grandmother, and they all helped shape me into the woman that I am today and really prepared me for the work that I have done with really incredible leaders like Mrs. Bush. And from the time I was little, I remember that both of my parents encouraged my sister and me and told us that we could do anything that we wanted if we would work really hard. And I'm sure that's true of most of us in this room. But they also encouraged us to lead lives of purpose. And I talked a little bit about this with some students this morning. Just through their example, to live a life with a strong faith, to be giving and compassionate. And that's what really drives me in everything that I do. So this has become the foundation for the woman that I am. So after college, I joined Governor Bush's campaign in California as a volunteer. I walked off of the street, I asked them if I could volunteer. I didn't have any association with the Bush family or with the RNC, but I went in and I worked really hard. I believed in the principles that Governor Bush stood for and ended up being hired on his campaign in 2000, worked on his advance team and traveled all over the country for them. And then did the Florida recount and worked on the inauguration. And I honestly, when I joined the campaign, never thought that they would know my name. And now I'm very blessed to have a close relationship with President and Mrs. Bush and to have really had a first-hand seat, if you will, to some of the most incredible historic events of the last 12 years or 15 years. And of course, one of those was September 11th. So I was at the White House on September 11th. I was a trip coordinator in presidential advance, and I was in charge as the trip coordinator of that event, of that day when he was in Florida. And when all the horrific events that we watched on the television started to unfold, we realized obviously that the White House could be a target. And in fact, there hadn't been a system put in place at the White House yet to alert the staff that they were being evacuated. So we found out watching CNN that the White House was being evacuated. So we all took off running. And I remember thinking about whether or not I should call my family to let them know, because I'm from California originally, and so it was 6 in the morning there. And I thought, should I wake them? As we were running, and the Secret Service looked at us and said, take your shoes off and run for your life. And I stopped and I said, are you serious? And he said, yeah. And I said, where are we supposed to go? And he said, run as far away from here as you can. And there was a plane that was coming over the White House, and we were running out of it. And I called my parents on my Los Angeles cell phone because that was the only one that was working. And I left a message for them on their machine, and I just said, we're running from work, or I'm running from my office, and just pray for us. And then my mom called me right back, and I explained what was happening, and we saw the Pentagon explode as we were running to our car. And that day obviously changed the course of my history, but all of our histories, and of our world, and obviously the Bush administration. For me, really on that day, I had to decide to go from fear to faith, because my instinct was to go back home to California and escape the terror. But I felt like God had a plan for me where I was, and I needed to stick it out and see it through. And that decision, I know, changed the course of my life and the next years that I spent. So I ended up working all 8 years in the White House with a dual assignment between the State Department and the White House for the last 18 months when I served as the Deputy Chief of Protocol. And during my tenure at the White House and my position at the Bush Institute, I've had the great privilege of traveling to more than 70 countries. And on these trips, I have met women from all over the world whose lives have impacted me deeply. Some of the women were champions of education and health in their communities, and others were struggling for basic human rights for themselves and for their families. And my interaction with these women really prepared me for the work that I'm doing now, for my passion and what I'm pursuing. So through my travels and work, I recognize that women are powerful catalysts of change. On every continent, there are compelling stories of women who are transforming their communities and their countries. And because women play such a vital role in affecting peace and health, education, and prosperity globally, we know that greater empowerment for women leads to great progress. As we all know, a little more than a century ago, women in the United States and parts of Europe began to demand equality in the workplace. And so at a time when women's rights and equality were dismissed as inconsequential, 15,000 women marched in New York City, demanding shorter hours and better pay, and the right to vote. Women have had the right to vote for less than 100 years in the United States, which shows you how much progress we've made. Today, we live really with the benefits of those courageous pioneers and their determination. The power of women has been seen in the United States history as well as all over the world. Women have spread in their influence to every corner of the world. And thanks to the efforts of courageous champions, women have made great progress over the last century. I think of Condoleezza Rice, who grew up in a segregated Alabama, becoming the first female African-American Secretary of State in 2005. Or Nancy Brinker, who I mentioned before, who at a time when the word breast could not be published in the newspaper, started Susan G. Komen for the Cure in 1982 and transformed our world from a health perspective. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was elected the first female president on the continent of Africa, who's now leading Liberia to a better future. So women like these have pioneered the way for so many and have provided an example of one's ability to transform entire countries. Women in every country now have the right to vote, but there's still a very long way to go. Too many women around the world don't even have basic opportunities. They don't have basic opportunities to get educated or to have health services or opportunities to work. The statistics are stark reminders of the obstacles that women face around the world. So when we look at them, women earn just 10% of the world's income, despite making up half of the world's population. And more than 2/3 of the nearly 800 million illiterate adults in the world are women. And because of a lack of access to health services, more than 350,000 women die in maternal deaths every year worldwide. So, in my opinion, these things can be changed, and they really must be changed. A century of progress has shown us that when you educate and empower women, you improve nearly every aspect of society. There's a famous Egyptian poet named Hafiz Ibrahim, and he said, when you educate a woman, you create a nation. And that is true. Studies show that when you educate a woman, her children are more likely to be educated, healthier, and their family is more likely to be successful. And research also shows that when women are included in the economy, countries are more stable and prosperous. So what we know is that investing in women has proven to be the best return on investment, with far-reaching implications. When we invest in women, we invest in future generations, we promote stability in communities, and stimulate prosperity globally. So I've had the privilege of working with women from Afghanistan, for instance, including the very active First Lady now, Rula Ghani. And after September 11th, when the world's eyes turned towards Afghanistan, we were shocked and horrified by the brutal treatment of women and girls by the Taliban. Girls were forbidden from going to school, and women were beaten or worse for leaving their homes without a male escort. Yet women in Afghanistan are some of the most courageous and strong that I've ever met. And I'll never forget one of the brave women that I've met and have the opportunity to work with. Her name is Razia Jan, who started schools for girls in Afghanistan. And when she's teaching her young female students to write, she teaches them to write their father's names first, not their own names. So that when they go home and practice, her cunning and clever tactic promotes pride in the girls' fathers and enables the girls to go back to school, because it does promote pride in their dads to see them writing their names. And then Dr. Sakina Yakubi ran underground schools at great risk to her own life during the years of the Taliban. She speaks passionately about the need in Afghanistan, but also about the progress. And there's a conference that we hosted at the Bush Institute, and she was one of our speakers, and she said, "Be patient with us. Don't be sorry for us, but be with us." And in the last dozen years, we've seen great strides in Afghanistan, but many challenges remain, especially for women. And we feel strongly that we must stand resolute with the people and the women of Afghanistan to ensure that all this hard-won progress and all the sacrifice that has been made isn't compromised or diminished. Over the last dozen years, there's been unbelievable progress, in fact. Only 5,000 girls were in school in 2001, and they were all in underground schools. And today, more than 3 million girls are in school in Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of women own their own businesses in Afghanistan now, when they weren't even allowed to leave their homes before. They serve as governors, they serve in the National Assembly, they serve as police officers and in the military. And the progress in Afghanistan must continue for them to have any hope of stability. The good news is President and Mrs. Ghani are extremely committed to promoting and protecting women in Afghanistan. They've actually opened cases of thousands of women that are in prison to ensure and to re-examine if their sentences were lawful. And because of this, as a result of it, many women have been released from prison. The Ghanis have also personally supported abused women, a shelter that they started in Afghanistan for abused women to provide them with safe havens. And they've had their cabinet also support that same shelter. And Mrs. Ghani has actually established the first formal First Lady's office in the history of Afghanistan. The interesting thing is she has 4 senior advisors. They're all in their 60s. She brought them in because she wanted to make sure that those advisors remember a time in Afghanistan when women were treated with dignity and were able to be educated. They worked and they contributed in society. And she believes strongly that's important to have those advisors surround the younger members of her team because they've experienced a different past in Afghanistan. They know a different vision. And it's not just a hopeful vision, but it's a reality in their minds. And so that's why she wants them as part of her team, which I think is very, very brilliant. On International Women's Day this past year of March 2016, the Bush Institute released a book called We Are Afghan Women, Voices of Hope. And it highlights the stories of 28 courageous Afghan women and one really interesting young Afghan man who have overcome enormous challenges and achieved incredible success. You know, there's a lot of bad news stories that come out of Afghanistan, out of the Middle East, and frankly, out of the United States of late. But we wanted to spotlight and shine a spotlight on the success stories through the book because there has been, like I said, incredibly hard-won progress in Afghanistan, and it's important for people to understand and know that. So I'd encourage you all to go get the book or tell friends about it or read about it. It's a really, really great, encouraging, inspiring book. So as I've said, around the world, we see women as leaders in life-changing progress that many could not have imagined just a few decades ago. In the winter of 2011, the world watched with cautious optimism as Arab women stood shoulder to shoulder with men, demanding equal rights and a representative government. So the scenes from Tahrir Square and Bourguiba Avenue in Tunisia reminded us of that oppression and injustice cannot crush the spirit of freedom. And in October of 2011, I had the great privilege of traveling to Tunisia as part of an international election observation team. And this relatively small country of Tunisia really changed the landscape of the entire region in January of 2011 when the protests broke out and resulting in the demise of the Ben Ali regime. And their elections were a direct result of their revolution. And so when I was there as part of the election observation, I was deployed to a small rural part of the country. And in fact, when we pulled up in our car, the parking lot was full of donkeys rather than, it was so rural that a lot of people came, a lot of farmers came on their donkeys or their horses to go vote. And there was a very, very long line waiting to vote. And one of my colleagues asked someone, how long have you been waiting to vote? And we were thinking they were going to say a couple hours, because that's sort of what we were trying to get at, and he said 30 years. And I was so struck by that, to think about how their lives, all of them were out to ensure that their voices were heard. So throughout the day, what struck me also is that I saw numerous women cast their votes, many of whom were illiterate, but all of whom were very determined to be part of that day. At this rural polling station I was telling you about, I witnessed one woman who found out that she wasn't registered at that station and was told to go somewhere else, but it was very unclear where she was supposed to go vote. And so we left and went to a different polling station about 10 kilometers away, and as we were pulling up, she was walking up, and she came and asked us where she should go vote. And of course, we didn't know, so we pointed her to the election officials. But what struck me is that for most Americans, that would have dissuaded them when they were told that they weren't registered there to vote, just to not vote. They would have just dissuaded them totally from voting. But this poor, elderly, illiterate woman was not deterred. She made her way to this other polling station 10 kilometers away. And I was just struck by her tenacity, her resolve, and really her desire to make sure that she was part of history and that her voice was heard that day. And as we all come up on this election, I think it's important for all of us to think about just the privilege we have in the United States to be part of our process. As Rola Dashti, she's a Kuwaiti woman who fought for women's suffrage in her own country, said, half a democracy is not a democracy. Countries can't leave out half of their population. So the success and progress of free societies depends on participation of all its citizens, men and women. And this is why President and Mrs. Bush feels so strongly and place such a strong emphasis on supporting women around the world who are lifting up their voices and asking to be heard. Both of them believe that women will bring about peace and democracy in the Middle East. So in fact, when I transitioned from being Mrs. Bush's chief of staff in September of 2011 to lead the Global Women's Initiative, President Bush actually sat me down and wanted to give me his sense and his vision. And so he said to me, this is very typical of President Bush, he said to me, Charity, Laura and I believe that women will lead the freedom and democracy movement in the Middle East, so get on that. And I was sort of like, that's all the advice you have? But it was a really daunting task when I thought about it. But then I really went to work to develop the signature program of the Women's Initiative, which is called the Women's Initiative Fellowship. And the Women's Initiative is designed to empower and equip women to transform their countries. And the fellowship itself identifies women leaders. So we equip women to become effective leaders and establish strong civil societies. Over the last 4 years, we've worked with 4 classes, 2 from Egypt and 2 from Tunisia. And because of my personal experience and work with these extraordinary women from Egypt and Tunisia, I wrote my thesis on it. So my thesis was entitled Lessons of the Arab Spring, Tunisia's Successful Transition to Democracy, Egypt's Lost Opportunities, and Why It Matters for Women. And the case study illustrates several important issues for us to consider for today's topic. So my research confirmed that Tunisia and Egypt have diverged in their approaches to governing, in their commitments and to the progressive reforms and institutions necessary to build and sustain a democracy, and in their inclusion of women. The result of their actions have led to vastly different outcomes. So Tunisia has been named the only free country in the Middle East and North Africa by Freedom House. And Egypt has been named the worst country of 22 Arab nations to be a woman. And its citizens live under the most repressive regime in recent history. Tunisia and Egypt both implemented reforms after they received their respective independence following their colonizations. And these reforms included the promotion of education, of workforce equality, constitutions that protected freedoms of press, assembly, publication, and of women, and allowed a robust civil society and political participation. However, Tunisia not only had more progressive reforms, but they also adhered to them and implemented them. And primarily that's because of leaders that they've had in their country. For instance, Bourguiba, and then Morsi, who's the Islamic Party leader, has been very influential in this time of transition. Egypt, in comparison, was less consistent with their implementation and adherence to the reforms. And some of this had to do with what, through my research, I found religious pressure and cultural traditions. So as a result, civil society, NGOs, political participation and activism, and women were suppressed throughout the regimes of Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, and equally or even more so under Sisi today. It's important to note and remember that women participated in the revolutions of both Tunisia and Egypt, but women have been allowed to play a greater role in Tunisia than in Egypt following the revolutions. In the case of Egypt in particular, women's hopes that the revolts would bring greater freedom and expanded rights for women have been thwarted by entrenched patriarchal structures and the rise of Islamists, and that's a quote. The reason why it's so critical to include and protect women in societies are supported by compelling and comprehensive research, which I referred to before. But one study shows that the best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well its women are treated. There are lots of great statistics that illustrate the benefits of women's inclusion. So as I said, when women are included in the economy, countries are more stable and prosperous. And women reinvest 90% of their income back into their community and their family, compared to men who would reinvest 30 to 40%. One study suggests that raising the female labor force participation rate to country-specific male levels would raise GDP in Egypt by 34%. Education, health, and combating violence against women also have incredible positive spillover effects. Additionally, it's important to recognize the benefits and advantages of democracy. So, for example, democracies don't go to war with other democracies. Democratic countries are more economically prosperous, stable, and sound, and from a purely human perspective, citizens enjoy protections and freedoms under the law that enable a more robust, involved, and engaged citizenry. So based on my research, it's my assertion that the different outcomes experienced by Tunisia and Egypt are a result of the reforms and institutions that each country implemented prior to the Arab Spring, and the leaders that governed and influenced their transitions. Additionally, I suggest that policies and laws, especially those related to women, play a significant role in the stability and success of countries. Although Tunisia and Egypt have adopted policies and/or laws particularly related to women and freedoms, the positive effects it only realized to the extent to which the laws are adhered to and implemented. So Egypt has suppressed civil society, political participation, and has discouraged women from actively participating in every aspect of society. The overthrow of the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood, whether or not you agree with them, by the military and General Sisi in 2011 quashed the spirit and the desires of the revolution and has ushered in a more brutal and oppressive regime in recent history. Sisi's harsh crackdowns have resulted in the derailing of institutions that are working to provide the underpinning of reforms that would strengthen Egypt's ability to realize its dreams of freedom and democracy. Fear has replaced hope, And unjustifiable prison sentences, increased terrorist activity in the Sinai, and regimes characterized by suspicion and brutality. And efforts to dismantle civil society has significantly set Egypt back in its pursuit for a better future. There's a saying that says, as goes Egypt, so goes the Middle East. And that's one reason why we actually started the fellowship in Egypt, because it has significant impact. So because of that, during this tenuous and alarming time in Egypt, policymakers and world leaders should be engaging with Sisi, in my opinion, to persuade the government to adhere to the laws that are part of the Constitution in the 2014 Constitution, which protects civil society, it protects freedoms, and it protects women. But despite the disheartening news in Egypt, I want to note that the Egyptian women fellows that we have worked with remain very active, they're very committed, and they're determined to contribute positively to their country. There are countless stories, and you can find some of their stories on the Bush Institute's website of how they're making a difference. But I'm